Welcome back, Keeping It Rural listeners. Lindsay and I are here today with another special guest, but one that's a little farther away from our Minnesota border. Ryan Volk is known as the California Farmer on social media, and he has opened the world of diverse ag. He has been in farming his entire life and is continuing the family legacy on the Volk Ranch, which started actually in 1933, which is pretty awesome. So when you have your centennial celebration, we want to come. He is funny and charming. And as livestock driven females, we're pretty excited for this conversation to get spicy on some food topics related to almonds. So without further ado, Ryan, welcome. Tell us about yourself and your California farm that started in 1933, right?
Yeah, it did. Hello, California farmer here, Ryan. And we've been farming here in California actually since the late 1800s, but specifically on this farm, we've been here since 1933. We have another ranch that is a little ways away from us that we've had since around 1910 or so, but this is what we consider kind of the home ranch. This is where everyone kind of decided that they were going to build and live. And so my grandpa was basically raised here, lived here his whole life. My dad lived here his whole life. And now I'm here raising my kids here. So it's definitely been in the family and we love it here.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you call an almond farm a ranch?
I think it's funny in the farming world, you get people who are so into farms or ranches. And so I guess I'm that same way. I consider a ranch more to do with livestock, things like that. And so for 70 years, that's what this ranch did, was we did sheep and cattle. And so it was always named the Volk Ranch. We have a big sign out front that says the Volk Ranch. So it's always been known as the ranch. Any friends or family refer to it as the ranch. And so now that we've kind of taken out all of the livestock ground and we've planted crops, it's a little more difficult because people are like, isn't it a farm? But we're so used to just referring to it as the ranch. So that's where I'll probably refer to it as a farm and a ranch throughout this whole thing.
No worries. I get it. You're good.
That's awesome. So we were joking a little bit ago that you are good friends with our very own Zach Johnson, the millennial farmer of Minnesota here. And that was our connection to you. Can you talk a little bit about how your farms evolved? Because what you're doing now is not what your grandfather did. You seem to be so much more diversified than what your history was. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, my grandpa, he actually did a lot of different things besides the cattle and sheep. We did corn, he did wheat, all kinds of different crops. I'm trying to think, we did replacement heifers for dairies, just a bunch of different things. And then my dad, when he took over in the early 80s, he took over doing the cattle and he just realized, man, the money is just not there anymore. And he didn't think he was going to be able to hold on to the ranch for very much longer with cattle. And so he actually, through his brother-in-law, got into the poultry industry and we started raising turkeys for Butterball. And so we raised turkeys.
Did that too. Yeah.
1989 is when he built the poultry ranch. So we have 10 barns, each are about 25,000 square feet. So about 250,000 square feet total. And so it's a pretty big operation, poultry operation for just a single family. And so got into that. And then he decided to lease out the cattle because he was so busy with the poultry ranch that we just decided to lease out the rest of the land. And we had a lot of cowboys throughout the years that have just leased the ranch when they didn't have winter pasture, and they would bring them here in the summer. So that's how that got started. And then I went to Modesto Junior College. And while I was there, I was studying agriculture, and I had a lot of friends who were in the area and like, how come you guys are still just doing cattle? This is prime farm ground, and almonds are doing so well with their prices and things like that. And why aren't you doing that? And so I remember going and asking my dad that, and he's like, hey, I wanted to, but your grandpa didn't want it because he didn't want to feel claustrophobic because of all the trees, how tall it is. And so he's like, I wanted to be able to see out. And so then finally my grandpa or some of our neighbors started planting, and he asked my dad, how come you guys haven't planted trees yet? And my dad's like, I've been wanting to forever. You're the one who told me not to. So
story of every generational farmer.
Yes. Those transitions are great.
Yeah, exactly. So then I went off to school, and while we were at school, we decided to start planting, and I would return home in the summers and help with the farm. And then once I returned from school in 2000, I graduated in 2017. I've been here since, and I just immediately took over. And then unfortunately, my dad passed away last year, complications with COVID. And so that was a tough thing. And so also I was thrown into the main head honcho a lot sooner than I thought I was going to be, but we've been able to take it in full stride, and we're still doing great. So that's awesome. Where we're at today.
Yeah. Deep breath, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
And now you're a
There's a lot.
social media tycoon.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say tycoon, but I sure have fun with it. That's sure.
We're recoining it now. That's what you're gonna be now.
Right?
Perfect.
So give us the basics, Ryan. How is the almond farming done? And what does it take to get started in almonds? Because it sounds like you made quite the transition. Like, not everyone, especially not in Minnesota, do you just switch from doing dairy cattle to almonds or beef cattle to almonds or chickens to almonds. What was that like? And then what's the timeline on almonds, growth wise? And I also want to know how tall the almond trees are if they're really taking up your view. That's curious to me.
Yeah, for sure. First things first, you got to be nuts, right? I mean, you just got to be pretty nuts to be able to get into this industry.
That's funny. I get
So,
it.
and it's so hard to talk about nuts without having some type of joke. If you ever want to, whenever Zach or Randy and I, whenever we get together and we start talking, we can't even have a serious conversation with it because it always leads to jokes every single time. And
I can't imagine.
So right off the bat, it's just a tough thing to talk about.
Ryan, just think about the t-shirts you could be selling.
Oh, I know. Exactly. And especially because, like you said, so going into like how we harvest is we actually have a machine called a shaker. And so it's a nut shaker, and it comes in and it shakes the trees, and then the nuts drop off the tree. And so it's like, I mean, it's got jokes for days.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
That's awesome.
But so yeah, it's definitely a large process because you got to realize too, because it is a permanent crop, it takes a while to produce. So you're not going to get a return on your investment really quick, just like when you're planting row crops and things like that. So you're going into it, you're going to be spending a lot of money. So you have to have capital to be able to do so and be able to have something ready to do that. So the timeline, we have to start, like with us, we had to start drying up our cattle pastures in the summer because here we have really hot, dry summers. We don't get, if any, rain at all during the summer, if any at all. But so we let it dry up, and then we just come through with these big, huge bulldozers. So these Cat D11 deep rippers, so huge, massive 230,000 pound machines that come through, and they've got a 6-foot shank on them that are going to go through, and they're going to deep rip. So we're trying to get at least 6 feet down into the ground. We're trying to break up this layer we have here called hardpan. And so we're breaking that layer up. Once that's broken up, then we do a lot of dirt work to prepare the ground. Then we're able to plant the trees. And then from the time the trees are planted, they'll produce starting their second year, but not enough to do any harvest or anything like that. But we'll start harvesting their third year. But you really won't see a return on investment till about year 5 or 7 or so. So it's really, you're really banking on it doing well.
And then how long do those trees live?
Typically, a good orchard will last 25 years or so. Some get pulled out a little earlier, some get pulled out a little later. So they're going to be around for a long time.
Yeah.
How many trees do you have now?
We have, now we're probably around 35,000 trees or so right now.
So how many almonds how much do you get off a tree? And then how much do you guys produce every year?
Here we go by how many pounds per acre. Okay. That's how we judge the yields that we have. Mm-hmm. So it really varies throughout the state. The further south in the valley you go, they have higher yields than up where we are. We're kind of the mid to north valley, and then the north valley has a lot less yields. But we're anywhere between, I'd say 25 to 3,000 pounds per acre is average for our area. Down south, you get a little higher. They can get up to 3,500 or even 4,000 pounds to the acre.
And is that because they're wetter?
No, it's because, down south has a longer growing season than up here. And so they usually have a better bloom time, which for us is in February. And for almonds, they have to be pollinated. And so you have the bees that get shipped here, and the bees need to have nice, warm, calm days to be able to be out working. And so the South Valley just is a little drier and a little warmer than it is up here. So what they lack the water that the North Valley has when it comes to water storage and being able to water our crops. When I say the South Valley, the Central Valley of California is that long strip, and it's about from the bottom of the valley to the north part of the valley. It probably takes you a good 6-hour, 7-hour drive. And so the South Valley, I would consider from Fresno south, that's where you see a lot more of the drought issues, that more so than up north.
That's interesting.
So will you kind of go over the basics of how you process the almond? I know you talked about bees, the growing. Will you kind of start from the beginning on how almonds are really produced?
Yeah, absolutely. Trees, they go into a dormancy when they drop their leaves. They're not taking any water or anything like that. And so really it's kind of a nice time for us to go through. It's still a busy time because we have to go through and prune and things like that. But mid-February or so, the trees will start to bloom. And that's when it's really pretty. You can just drive for days and you just see all these white flowers on all the trees. It's very pretty. Everyone wants to take their pictures and things like that. So it's always I always say it's the basic white girl out there in her sundress and her hat trying to take her pretty pictures.
Sounds like our sunflower fields.
Yes.
Yep, precisely. Before they even start to bloom, we bring bees in. So there's a lot of bees that come from all over, from the Dakotas, from Minnesota, from Idaho, like a lot of different places. It just so happens that our apiary is local, but I'd say the majority come from out of state and they bring their bees here. California supplies 100% of the nation's almonds and about 80% of the world's almonds. So there's not really many places in the world like California that can grow almonds like we can here. So it's pretty wild that during this time, I'd say a good solid majority of the beehives in the United States, commercial beehives, are here in California during almond bloom, just because of the demand. I don't know how many million acres of almonds we have here, but there's a lot of acres of almonds that need pollinated. And for pollination, we need about 2 hives per acre. It's quite a few bees that you need.
These apiaries, are they benefiting off of this? Are they selling the honeycombs after the season?
Because there's such a high demand, we pay a high price for the bees. So for them, they're actually getting paid just for the bees working for pollination. And so we're paying right now prices anywhere from $190 to $200 per hive. And so when you've got 2 hives per acre, that starts to add up, really fast. One of our biggest costs for the year is pollination, paying for the bees.
I would never have guessed that.
No. And I would have never thought that. And it makes sense that you have a targeted pollinator, but I guess I never would have put 2 and 2 together until you said that.
Yeah. So it's a pretty wild deal. That's the other thing too, is that almonds do not make a good honey. It is a very bitter honey. So they don't even get to they use it to help with the bees' health, but they're not going to be trying to harvest that honey and sell it by any means because it's a bitter honey. And so for them, it's strictly they're making money off of us having to rent the hives. And because there's so many acres, that's why the rental prices are so high. Because I hear of these other beekeepers after they go here, they go up to Oregon or they'll go to different places where now they're going to focus on the honey. So they need to go to these good like clovers and different things like that produce a good tasty honey. And so they're going to guys where they're not even paying. They're either not paying or they're having to pay to put their bees out there.
Yeah.
And so you hear that, you're like, you just wish that.
And for you, the bees are making the money.
Yeah, exactly. And then another disadvantage to that is, you're dealing with an insect. This year, for example, it was so wet here and so cold that during bloom, the bees weren't out working. So here we just paid all of this money to have these bees here, and we call them bee hours, how many bee hours you have in a season. And we just barely had any bee hours. They weren't out working. And so you pay this and you're at the mercy of Mother Nature. It's definitely a gamble. I mean, that's farming in general. Everyone knows that.
Is that covered under your insurance blanket then if the bees don't want to work and your harvest is off?
Yeah. So they'll definitely consider that when it comes to insurance. There's all kinds of resources that they can go to that will tell them your area how many bee hours there were. I mean, they legitimately keep track of the temperature and the moisture out. Okay, if it's above 50 degrees, the bees are out. But if there's moisture, the bees aren't out. So they keep track of that stuff. It's pretty wild.
That is wild. Man.
That's almost more interesting than the almonds.
Yeah, exactly.
But will you continue on from the pollination? What's your next step?
So the next step is irrigation is going to be starting. Beginning of April to mid-April, we've seen the last of our rains for the winter, and our springs are pretty dry. And so it's starting to dry up, and so now it's the time, and especially because the trees have now put leaves out, they're producing the almonds, and so now they're starting to require a lot more water. So now it's time for us we kick up with irrigation. And so we use micro sprinklers. We have sub mains that are underground that are PVC lines that are just permanently in the ground after we've done all that dirt work. And then after we do that, we have these black plastic lines that run down each tree row. And at each tree, there is a sprinkler, a little plastic micro sprinkler that's putting out about a 9-foot swath of water for these trees. And so we have to go through every week. We irrigate our trees every week. And so we have to go through and we have to make sure each one of those sprinklers is working. And so there's 30,000 sprinklers that you're having to check every week to make sure that they're all working. And so that's probably the most intensive part of our growing season is irrigation and making sure that we're not putting too much water on them. And then also obviously making sure they're getting the correct amount of water. It's a different atmosphere here versus there where you're trying to get rid of water and we're trying to get as much water as we can.
We could send you some right now.
Yeah. You want some?
Oh, I wish. We were talking about that. We were like, man, if there was a way that we could somehow just pipeline all the way, I was like, we could use all of that water. We could use it.
Dig a ditch to you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Sure.
So yeah, so during this time, irrigation is our busiest weekly duty that we're doing out here. We're also making sure that we keep our weeds under control because those weeds, if they grow up into those sprinklers, they'll clog up those sprinklers. So we're trying to make sure that at least right underneath the tree that there's no weeds. And so we do our strip sprays, and then so looking out for pests at this time. So our biggest pest in almonds is the navel orangeworm. And so it's actually a moth that will implant the eggs into last year's crop that didn't come off the tree, because not every nut comes off the tree when we do harvest. So they're looking for last year's nuts, and they go through and they'll lay their eggs, and then it turns into a little worm and it's eating that almond. So what happens is when they come out and that now they have new homes to go into, which is the new almonds that are being produced, they can just destroy your crop. We're looking for those. There's a lot of information on that. So we can hear, hey, they call them flights. There's going to be a flight in your area this next week. So we need to get out and spray. We have our orchard sprayers that we can go out, and it's a preventative, and it also will kill a navel orangeworm that's out there. We're really monitoring that because they'll wipe out your whole crop if you don't take care of them.
Yeah. So you got to have sprayers too.
Yes.
Are these like backpack sprayers, drone sprayers? What are we using?
No, so we're hooked up to our tractors. So the tractors we have are 120 horsepower John Deere tractors, but they're really compact. They're a real low profile because they have to go through these orchards, which have tree branches hanging out. And so we actually have these tractors that we actually have to have custom cabs made for, because John Deere doesn't really make a great custom cab for orchards. The cabs are just way too big. And so you'd be smacking branches and knocking your crop off. And so we have to have these really compact, they almost look like Star Wars looking cabs out there. And for a big guy like me, you're pretty tight in these cabs. We go through and we have a sprayer behind us, a PTO driven sprayer. And so it's got a 600-gallon tank, and then behind the tank is a big fan. And so then we have these spray nozzles. And so then what it does is that fan is pushing the air, and it pushes that spray way up into the tops of those canopies of the trees. And so we can spray up to about 35 feet above us with these sprayers. And so we go through and we use those sprayers for at that time. So yeah, it's a pull type sprayer.
And how fast can you drive that tractor?
The real question.
Because I mean, you have a lot of trees to get to, so I'm doing the math in my head here.
Oh, I thought you wanted to go tractor racing in the almond.
So that was the biggest key for us deciding what type of sprayer we wanted to get, because there's really two types of sprayers. There's a conventional sprayer, which is just, hey, we're trying to get as much volume out as we possibly can. And so those ones, you're having to go, 2 miles an hour, 100 gallons per acre into these trees, just trying to get as much coverage as you can. With the new technology we have these what we call electroblast sprayers. And so what they're actually doing is they're actually electronically charging those water molecules that are getting sprayed up into the trees. And because the trees are grounded, those positively charged water molecules are going to actually go and attract to those leaves. And so because of that, we can actually get a lot better coverage. And so that's why we chose to go with the electroblast sprayer, because now I can go about 4.5 to 5 miles an hour and only spraying 40 gallons per acre. So I'm able to really reduce the amount of tanks that I'm having to spray out there and get a full coverage. So it really speeds up our spraying.
Nice. So once we have predator control.
So once we have predator control, we're getting closer to harvest by this time. So harvest for us can be anywhere from the end of August through September and even through October, because you got to realize with most almond orchards, you have different varieties. So there's not just one almond out there, right? There's a lot of different varieties of almonds, and they taste different, they look different, and things like that. So the biggest money maker, I guess you could say, for almonds is the nonpareil variety. So that's the variety you're going to see in the cans, or when you're eating whole almonds, that's the variety that you're eating, is the nonpareil variety, because it's the tastiest, it looks the best, it gets paid the highest dollar. But the problem with it is it can't pollinate itself. And so you have to have other varieties out there to help pollinate. So we have 2 other varieties besides the nonpareils out there. And the way we space them out is that every other row in our orchard is nonpareil. And then the rows next to it is either this variety we have called Aldrich or this variety we have called Wood Colony. We have 3 different types of varieties out there. And so when it comes time to harvest, our nonpareils are going to get harvested first. And so they're ready to harvest usually before the other two varieties are ready. When you're picking varieties that you want to plant together, that's one of the things you have to think about is the timing, because you really don't want them to be wanting to get harvested at the same time, because then you're either going to be too early or too late on one or the other varieties.
So you can tell which variety you have?
What we do is at the end of the rows, we know that every other row is nonpareil. So we'll actually go through and we'll paint the end trees that you can see. We'll paint their trunks with a different color to see whether they're a wood colony. So for us, we do green for wood colony and a red for aldrich. Once you've been around it long enough, because that's the one thing too, you got to realize I've only been doing this since, I guess it's been 10 years now. So I guess I should know a lot more than I do, but
I think we all feel the same way.
Yeah.
yeah. That's why I said, I was like, man, they want to talk about almonds. I'm like, I know guys who've been doing this for 80 years. And I was like, they're going to watch, they're listen to this and be like, he doesn't no idea what he's talking about. But
They got things to learn too. It's okay.
yeah, exactly. 9 times out of 10, if I'm driving and I'm in the middle of the orchard and I can't see the ends of the trunks, I can still look and I can tell what they are. So they have different tree shapes. Our aldrich variety, the branches tend to kind of grow straight up. And instead of kind of branching out, they almost just go straight up. And so I can really tell the difference in our aldrich variety as I'm just driving through the orchard. Usually I can tell the difference between a wood colony as well. They're a smaller tree. They're almost kind of a bushier look. So you kind of get used to it, especially in your own orchard, being able to tell what they are. Harvest time, what we're looking for is the almond itself has 3 layers to it because it's technically like a fruit. It's actually a drupe. So it has an outer layer called the hull. You have the outer layer that's called the hull, and it's like the fruit layer. It's actually got sugar and it's got good nutrition to it. And when they're harvested, they'll actually separate that off of the almond, and they'll actually get sent in for like feed for dairy cattle and things like that because it has nutritional value to it. But it's just bitter. We're not going to eat it because it's not tasty to us, but we have a lot of dairies. So it gets mixed into a lot of dairy feed. But then you have the hull, and then after the hull, there's the shell that comes around it. And so the shell will actually get used in like biomass, or they'll grind it up real fine for a granular for soaps. And then they'll also use it for bedding for dairies as well. And then you actually get to the almond. So we're actually looking for, when it comes time to harvest, we're seeing if that hull is no longer green. It's starting to kind of dry out into a more of a brownish color. And then we'll go through and we'll actually take some off the tree. And if you can shake it and you can hear the nut rattling around inside, then you'll be able to tell that, hey, it's time to shake, it's time to go. And so we'll bring in our shakers. And so it's a machine that basically looks like it's got like a crab claw. And so it's got this claw, and it goes up and it grabs the trunk of the tree, and it has these countered weights inside that claw. And so what it's actually doing is it's just shaking that tree. And so that tree, and then all of the nuts will fall off the tree when we shake it like that. And then it moves on to the next tree. So it's one of those jobs that I would hate to have to do, because yeah, you're dealing with 30,000 trees. So we're just shaking them straight onto the ground. And so once they're on the ground, we're going to let them dry out for about a week. And then we'll come through with sweepers, and they're going to go through and they're going to sweep and blow the ends of the rows to make them, and they're going to sweep them into windrows for the harvester to come through and pick up. So now they've been swept up into a windrow. Then the actual harvester, the pickup machines will come through. It's kind of the same principle idea as like a combine. They're in there, they're going to be sweeping them up, and they're tossing them. They're launching the almonds across an area where there's a blower, and it's trying to blow out all the chaff, I guess you could say, all of the dust and leaves and everything that got swept up. It's trying to blow all that out of there. And then those almonds get loaded into a cart, and then we call them nut carts that are always constantly going back and forth, and they're going to be piling up all those nuts and taking them to the elevator to load in the trucks and ship out. That's really the basis of our harvest. Once that variety's picked up and out of here, because you don't want to mix them, then we start on the other 2 varieties, and they can be done at the same time because they're far enough apart. It's kind of a 3-part harvest, and so it can last anywhere, like I said, from the end of August through, you might be still going to the beginning of October. And so that's what it is. The almond itself isn't done. We're done on our part on the farm.
Right.
So now the almond is actually going to move, and it's going to be going to what we call our huller and sheller. And so they're going to be going through, and they're going to be removing that hull and that shell like I talked about. And then from there, it'll go to whoever we decide to sell to.
You retain ownership through that process.
Yes. Yep. So we're just paying them for doing that. So we don't have our own hulling and shelling equipment, which it's pretty extensive, huge machinery and equipment.
Yeah.
On a good year, what would you say like your loss is? Because you're going to consume loss not only from the orchard, but through the processing, I would assume as well.
Yeah. So typically for everything we ship out, we're probably anywhere between 1.5 to maybe 5% loss. That 5% loss usually comes from either navel orangeworm damage, or when they're on the ground, we'll actually go through right before harvest, we'll put out ant bait because the ants will come and they'll start to eat them as well. You're either having ant damage or navel orangeworm damage. I think that the industry is going to get to the point where, like right now, like the walnuts, for example, they'll go through a drying process, like an actual dryer somewhere. Where with almonds, there's so much almonds, you'd have to have massive dryers to be able to do that. But I do think the industry will go that way eventually, just kind of trying to figure out how. But I would say, yeah, our typical loss anywhere from 1.5 to 5% or so. Anyway, so going from the huller and sheller, so now that hull has been removed, the shell's been removed. Now they're going to get shipped. So like for us, we grow for Blue Diamond. That's kind of the most popular almond group that you see in stores and things like that.
I have them here at the locker. I could grab them for you.
There you go.
Yeah.
So we also send some to a local guy, but he doesn't sell them on shelves or anything like that. He'll sell them in bulk and he'll export those kind of more to the Asian markets. We always say that the one everyone recognizes is Blue Diamond. And it's a co-op. So technically it's grower owned.
It is. I didn't know that.
I'm talking with Zach and talking with people who like in the Midwest who deal a lot more with co-ops. It doesn't sound necessarily like the same. It's definitely grower owned and the board of directors are growers, but we have a CEO that we hire and we have all of that. It's just a totally different company when it comes to that, but we really enjoy growing for them. They really treat the growers great and they make a great product.
I was just going to ask, when we think of Blue Diamond, what are some of those products? Because some people, they strictly consume almond milk or they strictly consume like a certain serving of almonds a day. But what else is there? What are you guys producing?
It's pretty crazy, like what they've been able to come up with just in like the last 10 or 15 years or so. And I think it has to do with because of how many almonds have been planted. It's really a great food. And when it comes to health and protein content and value and things like that, it's a really great benefit. And so you've got obviously what you're going to see in the store in the bags. That's your typical plain raw almonds, right? Or they've got the different seasonings and things like that. Then you've got the different varieties that we plant out here. A lot of times they're not as tasty as those almonds that you're going to be eating out of the can. So those will get put into like candies because, you think about like Almond Joys or you think about these candies products that have almonds mixed in with them. And then you've got like almond milk. That's kind of the big controversial one. And then you've got almond butter. You've got almond flour. I think they've even come out. There's like almond yogurt, almond protein powder. Blue Diamond, I feel like, has done the best when it comes to different ways of selling the almond, right?
Yeah.
And they're kind of the pioneers when it comes with the almond milk. And it's really interesting because I didn't really even put two and two together of people not necessarily being thrilled with the idea of almond milk until I started doing the social media. And I was saying I was an almond farmer and I kind of got some backlash from people. What's funny about that, I said, I have friends that I went to high school with and that live all in this area. I said, they're dairy farmers and almond farmers. And I said, for them, they took their dairy ground that they were raising their own grains and raising their own feed for their livestock, that they're like, hey, we'll actually make more money if we buy our feed and we do almonds on that ground. And so they ripped out all that ground and they put almonds in. So I've got a lot of friends who do both.
It's so ironic. I love it.
Yeah.
So before Becca asks you her dying question that she's been burning on for weeks to ask you, can you just circle back quick and just quick talk about like the margins in almonds and then how is that price set and how is that decided or driven?
That would be a question for someone else. I'm not an expert when it comes to that, but the margins, they used to be really good.
Yeah.
And it was to the point where like guys in our area, they were getting anywhere from $3 to $5 a pound. So when you're producing, some of these guys were producing 3,500 pounds to 4,000 pounds to the acre. They were making a lot of money. And in fact, I always called it monopoly money, right? Like some of these guys, it's hilarious that these old timer farmers that like you've known your whole life, they drive the old beat up trucks and they still have their old beat up trucks, but now they're living by the golf course. They've got their Mercedes, they're doing very well for themselves. And of course we decided to plant during that time. And of course our first crop comes and the price just plummeted. It's still good. So I'd say the last few years, it's been such a volatile market, which usually the reason people went with almonds was because it was such a steady market. You knew you were going to be steady compared to most of the other things in your area. And so the last few years have been a little different when it comes to that, but it still is pretty consistent. When we first got into it, we were making probably $2.75 a pound or so. This last year, it dropped down to $1.40. And now we're back. I think we're getting closer to the $2 range.
That's awesome.
Right now. The biggest effect for us was exports because it's such a big export crop. And so for us, we've had a lot of carryover because when the ports were closed, oh my gosh, that threw us off, and we'll probably be recovering from COVID for the next few years.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. And how much of our almonds are exported?
Oh, that's a great question. I honestly don't know. I do know that the bulk of almonds are exported. The market here is growing. I mean, with the almond milk and with people just in North America becoming a little more health conscious, there is a lot bigger market in the United States than there used to be. Europe has really grown. Europe, the last few years, has been really one of the biggest growers for that. But definitely the Asian market has been our biggest because to them, it's actually a huge staple of their diet.
Yeah, they cook a lot more with them too.
Yes, a lot more. And so I would say the Asian market is definitely our biggest market when it comes to almonds.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah.
Like, you got to ask him. You have to ask.
Okay. I have lots of questions because I just do. So I grew up a quarter mile from my uncle's dairy farm. And I was Princess K of the Milky Way once upon a time. So I have a 90-pound block of butter with my face in it. And so dairy is kind of important to me. So I want to ask, I've been dying to know, and I've been looking for years, but I just don't know where to find the udder on an almond. How do you make an almond?
I want to tour your milking parlor.
They're
Yeah,
tiny
and
little
how big
udders.
is the bulk tank?
Exactly. That was one of my first videos I did on Instagram. I started on YouTube, but then I moved to Instagram. I did it, and I wish I would have done it as an actual post. I just did it as a story, but I did it as a story to tag a lot of dairy farmers on there. And so what I did is I was out in our orchard, and so I was out there and I started whistling, like, come on. I was like, come on, girls. And I was like, this is just weird. I was like, they're just, usually they love to be milked. So that's how I actually, because of that video, is how I became friends. I don't know if you're familiar with Derek Josie.
Yeah, I know Derek.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's how I became friends with Derek, was actually that video, and I had tagged him in it. And before then,
he actually has a pretty similar video that's on his channel.
Yeah. And him and I became really close. And so, in fact, we still are close friends. He just called me the other day. And so that started up a cool relationship with him. And then a lot of different other dairy farmers. I think that's what's tough, is because you're in an industry where you're so passionate about what you grow, right? And dairy is no different. I mean, a very passionate group of farmers. It was interesting being able to kind of come into the scene, as there's not that many almond growers that are on social media or that kind of have that presence. And so to kind of like sneak in, I was like, hey guys, and I'm the almond farmer here. How you doing?
Yeah.
And so I actually Derek actually let me take over his Facebook one day, and I did a whole thing kind of like on like how there's space for both, right?
Yeah.
And like how it's not like almond milk is here to replace dairy. It's an alternative. It's a thing for people who maybe have lactose intolerant or who struggle with that kind of a thing. My wife, for example, for her, she hates the idea. She hates the idea of drinking her calories. She's like, I would rather not drink my calories. Yeah. And so for her, she likes almond milk for that reason. Me, I can't stand it. I hate this stuff. I was like, I will stick with milk every day. And so I am very much I'm a huge supporter of the dairy industry. And so that's what I always tell people. And I think a lot of it too is the focus so much on milk and realizing like, hey, dairy is a lot more than just milk.
Yeah.
That's why I think there's a space for both.
Which I feel like in agriculture, we sometimes forget.
Yeah.
Like you said, we get so passionate about what we're doing. And then all of a sudden, when it becomes competitive.
Exactly. And food labeling really comes into play too with that, right?
Yeah.
Because I see both sides. I see so like right now, for example, and I don't know if this is still true or not. This was about a year ago. I remember talking with a guy at Blue Diamond and asking him, I said, how come it is that we do call it almond milk? And he goes, if you notice with Blue Diamond, he's like, Blue Diamond's container is almond breeze. He goes, and it's very little print that it says almond milk. And he goes, there's a reason.
Word.
Yeah, he goes, there's a reason why they did that with having almond breeze, the huge label, and almond milk. Because he goes, if ever it came down to where they did change it so that we couldn't label it as milk, we'll be able to take that almond milk thing off without anything like that.
Right.
The interesting thing, though, that he was saying is that right now, because of food requirements, he goes, we are required to have it labeled on there to say almond milk. And so he said,
Really?
they're
Oh.
required to have it on there as almond milk, because if you're going to be producing it as a milk alternative, it has to have that term on it. And so it was really interesting, like him saying that's why we really wanted to be focused on the whole almond breeze campaign versus almond milk idea to it. And so that's, yeah, food labeling. And that's a whole nother conversation, right? Because I do poultry
Right.
as well. We still do chickens. And oh man, don't even get me started on food labeling marketing.
No antibiotics.
When it comes to
No.
that. Oh my gosh. Yeah. No antibiotics, no hormones added, all of that crap. Oh,
Yeah.
drives me
You know how
nuts.
far it's going? I just got a call that federally on my meat labels, we're going to have to identify the part that cut comes from. So it won't be a T-bone. It'll be a short beef, short loin, T-bone of.
Oh, okay. No, that makes a lot more sense. I
Right?
get it now.
Right, you got it now?
Yeah, that really
Yeah.
clarifies a lot, Linz.
That really clarifies a lot. People in the store are going to love that.
No. I want to meet the people that make this stuff up and be like,
Right.
how'd you get your
Yeah.
job?
It's one of those things, like, for example, in the poultry industry, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, I'm very appreciative of what you guys do, because you're what sell our product. You're what help us to be able to get the biggest returns. But at the same time, I can't stand you
No.
because you're also making it so that there's so much misinformation out there.
Yeah.
You're making it so that, and that's what I like. That was my biggest thing. For example, Blue Diamond did whoever was in charge of their Instagram, the social media side of things, about a year or two ago, they had put out a post, and it was something, I don't remember what it was. I just remember reading it, and I said, I see that as kind of a dig at the dairy industry. And so I texted the guy that I'm really good friends with that kind of does a lot of the social media stuff there. And I said, hey, I sent him a screenshot of it. And I said, hey, did you guys approve of this? And he sent me a thing back. He goes, no, like, he goes, I haven't seen that yet. And so within like
Correct.
minutes, they had taken it off. We can promote our product without demonizing the other products out there.
Absolutely. And there
You
is
know
a
what I mean?
promo, right? Yeah. If it's on that shelf at the store, there is a reason it's there. So,
Yes.
and I think that food labeling is probably the reason, or I could say the guilty culprit, that is why we are so hard on each other. Like the
Yeah.
reason that dairy got hard feelings about it. I remember when FDA came out and was trying to do that fight against the word almond milk, and it had to be one word without a space in it to be used and all these things. And that's what really got the dairy industry hurting about it, was
Yeah.
when milk was brought into the conversation. If it would have been almond beverage or anything else, I think it would be completely different.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting how those regulations can truly be pivotal in how we look at each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even a couple of weeks ago, I was testifying up with the Ag Committee here in Minnesota at the Capitol, and it was the topic of conversation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it'll be a never-ending topic, though.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I agree too. I can definitely see arguments for both sides.
Yeah.
That's why I'm glad I'm not involved with that side of things, because I don't know what to do. I just want to farm.
Just leave me alone. And I feel like that is like the truest statement across the United States of every farmer that we've ever talked to. It's just,
Leave me
Yep.
out of it.
let me do my gig.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So-
Exactly.
No, you just keep doing you. There's a place for your almonds too. No worries.
Yeah.
For sure.
But on that note, for those of us that don't know how almond milk is made on an industrial level, can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't seen how they do it on an industrial scale. I know it's very similar to how like someone would do it at home. So like, for example, my wife will make her own. After we'll harvest and we get them sent to the huller and sheller, we can tell those guys, hey, hold back 50 pounds or so for us for this next year. We can bag up and have for ourselves and things like that. So she'll put in almonds in a blender, mixes in with so much water. I don't know what the ratio is. But then after you do that, then she has like the different size sifters. It's a lot of work sifting it through and getting it to where you're not having this grainy, it's more of just a liquid. It really has much more of a smooth texture to it.
I know we're running out of time, Ryan, and we don't want to keep you, but I know all of farmers across the United States and all of their specific states have issues with the government of their states. Your state, unfortunately, seems to be one of the more challenging states to be in agriculture in. And on top of that, you guys are kind of in a disaster zone right now with a lot of flooding, from what I understand. Can you kind of touch on some of the challenges and what's going on in the state of California right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for all of the people in
Yeah,
California.
fair.
But I know that there are a lot of areas that have been really affected by this flooding. And the fact that it hasn't really been national news is very surprising to
Shocking.
me.
Yes.
And because, like, not realizing, I think people don't realize too, is how big of an impact California has on the nation's food supply. And realizing that, hey, maybe the reason why some of these groceries when at the grocery store are ridiculously priced is because California kind of got wiped out with so much rain and with flooding and things like that. Like I said, I can't believe that's not a bigger story than it has been. A lot of these farms that have been wiped out. I can speak for our area where not only the high moisture that we receive just from rain saturated the ground so much, and there's a grower just down the road from us that well over 75% of his orchard got blown over. And so he'll just have to go through and pull out that orchard and replant. And like I said, you're talking a 5 to 7 year return on investment. And he had younger trees as well. So that has been a huge impact. And not only national news coverage, but even just our state. I think sometimes what's hard is when you have a state that has such a large majority of its money comes from other things, right? And yet what's crazy is I think, like, I don't know the exact numbers, but California, when it comes to the revenue that comes in, you're talking $50 billion in ag revenue. And the next state, Texas, is maybe like 20 or
Right.
something like that. So, I mean, it's just a huge gap. So you think that, hey, they're the largest ag state in terms of production and bringing in receipts, but yet that doesn't even touch California's GDP. And
Right.
so when California, they don't care. It's very unfortunate, especially since our capital is in Sacramento, which is surrounded by farmland. How can you even do what you do? So it's tough. It is tough to be able to farm here. I always tell people, hey, I didn't choose to farm here. If I could go back in time and warn my great great grandfather, maybe I would. But at the same time, I do love living here. It's a great place location wise. Being able to go to the beach within an hour and a half, be up in the snow in an hour and a half, and be surrounded by farm country, it's great. But California is very unique. It's just interesting the legislation and regulations they decide to have and the ones that they don't decide to have. So, for example, you would think in a state that is so worried and concerned about droughts and about water and things like that, that there would be regulations concerning pumping groundwater for farms. At the current moment, there are no regulations for pumping groundwater. You can pump as much water as you want.
That is
And
shocking.
you know what?
That's
Yeah.
crazy.
That's shocking.
Now there is regulation coming down the line, but I don't know when they've said that for the last 10 years that this regulation's coming and it still hasn't. So it's interesting the things that they are willing to regulate and the things that they aren't. To me, something like that would be something that you would for sure think would be regulated.
Yeah.
But no, they're actually more concerned about, we have our other farm, that's our other ranch that's north of here, and we can't plant almonds on it because it is an endangered tiger salamander territory. And so we can't plant because if you deep ripped and things like that, you'd be disturbing the endangered tiger salamander. And so the things that they decide to regulate and things they don't decide to regulate is a joke. I almost feel like that is the biggest annoyance when it comes for farming here, is like the things they decide to regulate and the things not to regulate.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't make any sense. Makes zero sense.
In your mind, when it comes to the environment, because that's where a lot of your struggles come in, what do you wish that people knew environment wise?
I wish the people in California are, I always say this, the people in California, but yet I'm talking about two cities basically, LA and San Francisco. The rest of the state's great. But LA and San Francisco, they need to realize that their water comes from the same source that our water comes from when it comes to agriculture.
Mhm.
And so when we pass laws that it's going to send out, they want 40% unimpaired flows. So we get our water from the Sierra Nevada mountain range. It's a huge mountain range here in California. And so that's where we get all our snow. And that's where all our irrigation water comes from, at least in our area, comes from that snowpack. And so does the water for San Francisco. In fact, the main huge pipelines are about a mile down the road from my ranch that send the water from the mountains to San Francisco.
Oh,
Because
wow.
if they didn't have that water from the Sierra Nevadas, there would not be enough fresh water in San Francisco to provide those people. Because besides the direct coast of California, California is a very arid climate.
Yeah.
It's a desert.
All of those California dairy commercials and all the other, like, it's green grass growing everywhere.
And that's, like I always tell people, it's about 6 months and 6 months. So you have six
Yeah.
months of dry, 6 months of green. About half the year you're green, half the year you're brown.
I'll trade you.
So Yeah, I always tell people, I'm like, it's still a great place. It really is. But so one thing I wish they knew is that, yeah, that our water is extremely precious. And so it needs to be dealt with in a very like-minded manner.
Yeah.
And what happens is the environmental groups that are out there, they do such a good job of promoting their side of things and promoting the action that I think California, especially now with the last 20 years track record of California, anyone who fits into those politician seats, we got to side with environmental because we're always the top of the environmental things like that. So we always have to side with environmentalists no matter what.
Have to uphold that position.
Exactly. And so it's a really uphill battle for us as farmers because we're already seen as enemies. We're already seen as people who are poisoning the ground and things like that. We're seen as a number one enemy to environmentalists. Whereas yet it's like, we're without us, where does your food come from?
Right. And almonds too, they're a nutritional powerhouse.
Ryan, tell us where we can find you.
Yeah. So I'm on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook and TikTok. And I'm California Farmer. That's the handle I have.
Impressive. You were able to take the first CA farmer position.
Right? That's what when I started doing this, I was like, oh, someone already has to have that.
Yeah.
Kind of like an email where you're like A Smith 1 or A Smith 20.
Yeah. Yep. Nope. It was there.
Hey, good for you. I like it. So Ryan, we've learned so much today, and I extremely appreciate the honesty when you talk about the challenges, especially environmentally, when we talk about things like water and the uphill battles that government can be. But what do you think out of all of these things? How are you keeping it rural?
I think the biggest thing to me is when I'm out working and I can see my kids out playing, or I can see my brother-in-law driving the tractor beside me, or cousins that are out here on the same ranch and same farm working, and seeing kind of the legacy that's there. There's nothing better to me. There's nothing better than being outside in nature, seeing things grow, seeing things that you've put all your heart and soul into being produced, and being able to harvest that and see legitimately the fruits of your labor. And there's nothing better. I'll put up with any regulations. I'll put up with living in the state of California. I'll put up with whatever it can be if I can continue to live this lifestyle. And that's how I'd say I'm keeping it rural.
Makes the uphill battles worth it, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely. It's not a party without you there. Follow Our Crazy on Facebook and Instagram, and be sure to check out all episodes and extras at keepinitruralgirls.com.
That's all, folks.